Well, good afternoon and welcome to the CRSB webinar on 2020 Sustainability Trends in Food and Agriculture. My name is Andrea White and I'm the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef's Community Engagement and Marketing Manager. And I'm coming to you today from my home in Manitoba. Today's webinar will focus on our food and agriculture trends and how opportunities for beef sustainability may fit into these. And we'll also have a little look about how some of these trends may have been affected by and shifted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic that we find ourselves in. This is the second webinar being hosted by CRSB, and last week we had a great panel discussing the impacts of COVID-19 on the various aspects of the beef value chain. And if you didn't get a chance to attend that, you can feel free to visit our website at crsb.ca and look under the About tab and events for a recording of last week's webinar, as well as to register for some of our upcoming events. Just to give you an outline of our agenda for today's webinar, we'll keep this within an hour of your time today. And I would like to welcome Joanne McArthur as President of Nourish Food Marketing and Len Kahn of Kahntact Marketing as presenters in today's webinar. I'll also note that Joanne and Len are part of a team that's currently working with the CRSB to expand on our marketing and communication strategy internally, and we're really pleased to welcome them here to share our expertise with us today. We will have a question and answer period following the presentations that we will use with the webinar portal, which I'll go through in a few minutes, and then a quick wrap up. So before we get started today, I'd like to just review a few logistics about the webinar today. You'll notice that you've been muted as you logged on, and then following our featured speakers, again, we'll open up to a Q&A session, which will be moderated by us here, that you can pose your questions to any of our speakers. This will be done via the questions window that you can see at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. And you can simply type in any question you have there, and we'll get to as many of those as possible within the time allotted. And if we do happen to have too many to get to, we will make sure that we address those offline of the webinar. And just to note that you can enter those questions at any point that they come up in the webinar, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. I'd also like to note that the webinar today is being recorded. So if anybody who was registered wasn't able to attend today, or if you'd like to go back and review anything afterwards, that will be made available within a few days of the webinar happening. And we are posting some of those recordings on our events page at crsb.ca as well. So before we get started, I'd like to just provide a brief overview about the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So for those of you here today who may not be as familiar with what we do, we are a multi-stakeholder, not-for-profit organization. And our mission is to advance the continuous improvement of Canadian beef industry sustainability through engagement, collaboration, communication, and science. And as you can see on this slide here, we have three main pillars of work that we work to advance that sustainability window. And the first is sustainability benchmarking. And this is done through our National Beef Sustainability Assessment and provides a comprehensive overview of the sustainability of the whole beef industry from farm to fork from the perspectives of environment, social, and economics. A sustainability strategy sets goals for continuous improvement. And our first assessment was released back in 2016. And earlier this year, we released an interim report to show some progress. But as with continuous improvement, there is always more to do. So we are looking towards our next assessment, which is expected to be released in 2023. Our second area of work is our Certified Sustainable Beef Framework, which is a voluntary certification program that recognizes sustainable practices in beef production and processing, which are measured against sustainability standards through a third-party auditing process. It also supports our retail and food service companies to help them meet some of their sustainable sourcing commitments and goals, and also provides assurances for consumers, which are delivered via a logo and claims. We currently have 3 companies using the logo. We have over 1,200 farms and ranches that are certified to the production standard, and 4 processing plants certified to the sustainable processing standard. We're pleased that over 4.9 million pounds of beef have already been sold with a CRSB claim since the program launched in 2017. So we're seeing great progress. And finally, our sustainability projects pillar enables us to really show that continuous improvement in sustainable beef production through on-the-ground projects that demonstrate, pilot, promote all the goals in our strategy. And this is facilitated mainly through an annual survey, which is currently open until the end of May. And so we invite you to, if you have a project that you think might fit into the goals, check out our website and then submit that survey. And some of those projects are featured on our project inventory on our website as well. So in terms of how we define sustainable beef, CRSB has adopted the definition of beef sustainability, as well as the 5 principles from the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which is a similar organization to ours operating at the global level. And those 5 principles of natural resources, people in the community, animal health and welfare, food, and efficiency and innovation are really underpinned by that economic viability to ensure that we incorporate all the pillars of that definition. As I mentioned in our benchmarking work, we accompany that assessment with a strategy. And so in 2016, we identified these 10 goals that our CRSB and our membership all work on collaboratively. And so currently we're in a long-term goal setting process, and we're looking to expand some of those current goals, make them more robust and specific, and then put specific timelines around them. So really excited about that work that's happening. We are really proud here at the CRSB of our diverse membership. And this snapshot really gives you a great view of the diversity across the whole beef value chain from beginning to end. And it's really the engagement of this collaborative group of folks that are part of what we do that really has made the CRSB such a global leader in beef sustainability. So driven by our membership, we have over 110 members and observers, and that includes people from beef producers and producer organizations, our processors, our retail and food service companies, NGOs from the conservation, the environmental, animal care groups, food and agriculture businesses, academic institutions, individual scientists, researchers, and our youth. So it's really exciting to see how many people are really interested in what we're doing and are involved. And with that, I am pleased to introduce you to our panelists for today's discussion. We have Joanne McArthur, who's really spent a career building brands with consumers and retailers at Molson, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and Cadillac Fairview. As a divisional president of Molson & Coors and a member of its North American management board, she led the charge to sell more beer more profitably. As a founding partner and president of Nourish Food Marketing, where she comes to us today, Joanne builds powerful brands for food and beverage products in Canada, the US, and Europe, and creates marketing strategies that help move those products off the shelves and into the consumer shopping basket, onto their plates and into their hearts. She's worked with entrepreneurs to launch award-winning products, and as well as municipal, provincial, and federal agencies to create programs that support Canada's food industry. She's been an instructor at Schulich Executive School of Business, Food Starter, which is a food incubator, as well as the Sponsorship Marketing Council of Canada and the Association of Canadian Advertisers. And our second speaker will be Len Kahn, who's the president and strategist of Kahntact Marketing. And from solid start on his family's Ontario dairy farm and cattle export operation, he took his passion for farming to the business world. Moving quickly from a valued employee for agribusinesses, he found a home in agriculture advertising. And Len started his own firm, Kahntact Marketing, which quickly grew to 20 people. In 2002, he merged that company with AdFarm, one of North America's leading agricultural communication firms. Back in 2007, he brought Kahntact back to the agricultural marketplace and has been working as a strategic level to develop marketing plans and brand strategies for leading agribusinesses, including Agricor, Bayer Animal Health, Bayer Crop Science, the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, the Dairy Farmers of Ontario, Farm and Food Care Canada, and many others. So before we begin, I'd like to do a quick poll of the audience. And so the way we're going to do this is a question will pop up on your screen, and we'll ask you to just select your answer, and then we will populate the results so we can just kind of have a little level set about where people are thinking. And this is about where your optimism sets about the future of the Canadian agriculture industry. I'm going to launch the poll here, and it should show up on your screen. So if you just select what you think, and then we'll populate the results in a few seconds. I'll close the poll in just a couple of seconds here. And our results are very positive. Looks like 56% of us are feeling more optimistic than before the pandemic started. So that is really good news. And with that, I will hand over the presentation status to Joanne, and she will provide us with her, her presentation today. So Joanne, I'm switching over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. Hopefully everybody can see that. Does that work? Looking good?
That works. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. Great introduction. I'm going to get right into it because we don't have a lot of time and there's lots of interesting things. So Andrea mentioned that we work with Len's group, and that's really to try to bridge this gap between farmers and consumers. And as you know, there's a huge gap, and you don't become an ag specialist overnight. Certainly, Nourish was not going to become one. So that's why we work with Len and his team to try to bridge that divide between the two groups, because we often stay in our own little bubbles. And one thing by working in food, and we work across the entire food ecosystem, so we work with producers, processors, manufacturers, retailers, food service, associations, not-for-profits. We've got sort of a very privileged view of the whole food ecosystem. And so 4 years ago, we started doing our own trend report. And we do that using a lot of research that we have in-house, a lot of proprietary research that we've conducted, as well as different studies that are already out there. And I should say we make no value statements with the trends. You can see we've been pretty, I think, prescient the last 3 years. And you know, if you're like me, oftentimes you'll see a study and you'll think, huh, that's interesting, not what I would have thought. And there are outlier studies, so we always take a bit of a triangulation approach. We want to make sure that we're seeing similar trends in from a number of different studies before we actually think that that's making a difference. So these were the trends for the past 3 years. We came out with our 2020 trend report in November, and these were the trends. I'm not going to go into all of these. I'm going to go into the ones I think are most appropriate and relevant for you. And I'd say these trends were all looking pretty good until this happened, right? And if anybody tells you that they know what's going to happen, they're lying. We are in unprecedented times. You cannot predict the future based on the past anymore. But what does happen in a time of upheaval is it will result in changing some of the trends we made, and in other cases, it will amplify or put other trends on steroids. I think behavioral scientists say it takes about 3 weeks to get a new habit. And if you think about, we've had a forced change in habit for much longer. I think it's up to 8 weeks. I don't even want to count anymore. It's too depressing. But that kind of change is going to have some long-term effects. And certainly what we've seen, you know, in with COVID world, And I say that rather than post-COVID, because who knows, if we ever get post-COVID, it may just be we end up living in a COVID world and managing it. And what we saw initially was huge shift in share of stomach. So we've gotten to that tipping point where we were actually sourcing more of our food out of the house than in the house pre-COVID. And then COVID happened and immediately it swung the other way. And so that's why you've seen, I don't have to tell you, you understand how the distribution system works. That huge shift from food service and different distribution systems trying to service grocery. What I find interesting is people that I think would understand that concept had no idea of how distribution systems within food service and grocery actually worked. So you've seen this huge shift there. You now have consumers doing what I call shopping missions. They're going out every 2 weeks. It's stressful to be shopping these days. If you're doing it in person, brand loyalties have gone down. In a lot of cases, you can't even, if you grab something off a shelf, you have to take it, you can't put it back. And there's shortages. So very different in terms of these shopping missions. Consumers are also being more mindful about what they're buying. If you're only shopping every 2 weeks, you're going to want to make sure that what you're buying is going to stay fresh for that period, or it's going to freeze well. And we've moved from a point where consumers were kind of summoning their meal and assembling it or heating it up to these newfound cooking skills. You know, we had said a couple of years ago that only 10% of consumers actually enjoyed cooking. Even though sales of cookbooks were going up, actual cooking skills were going down. And, you know, I think in one of our trend reports a couple of years ago, we showed a woman at a sewing machine and saying, you know, is this going to go the same way as sewing? Everybody used to have a sewing machine in their household. And now in Toronto, in some cases, you've got condos that don't even have full kitchens anymore. But that has changed all of a sudden. You know, people working at home, educating kids at home, trying to find family activities. So what we're now seeing are these newfound cooking skills becoming a family activity. And there was just a McKinsey study that came out, and they showed that cooking at home was the #1 increase in activity during the period, and that was a 54% shift. We also, up until this point, had become largely snacking nation, and especially with younger generations, you know, look at protein bars and smoothies and portability and convenience. That's all changed. Protein bars are way down. We're now actually sitting down and going back to the traditional 3 square meals a day. And I think part of the reason for that is that whole routine of meal preparation and eating together just gives us a sense of being in control. And I think that families are reconnecting over food and preparing food in the kitchen. Kids are also picking up new skills and newfound confidence. So I do think that longer term, this behavior is going to stick. I think consumers are going to realize, hey, we're eating healthier, it's costing us less money, and it's fun to do. And hey, you know, we've picked up some pretty decent skills here. So I think that will be something that continues longer term as our confidence in the kitchen has soared, and as well as the enjoyability. Food waste has also become a real top of mind issue. And in fact, a lot of consumers, if you ask them about sustainability, the first thing that comes to mind is food waste. That would have been before COVID, now even heightened because everybody's trying to get food to last. They don't want to throw anything out of their fridge if they're only going on shopping missions every 2 weeks. So there's a real heightened awareness of that. And of course, there's also a return to comfort foods. They make us feel safe and loved, and comfort foods tend to be things that we ate when we were younger. And so we see a rise in those sort of things, as well as some new routines. quite often we're finding our days are just kind of melding into the next one. Is it Monday? Is it Friday? You know, is the day over, the work day over? It all is just kind of melding. And so to try to get a little control over that, new routines are also popping up there. So this whole idea of the quarantini to mark the end of the workday has popped up, just as we try to transition and stay somewhat normal. So one of the trends we talked about was Unpackage Me. And that was this whole idea around waste, packaging waste largely, but looking at solutions beyond recycling. Because I think there's a recognition that recycling doesn't work all that well, right? Not everything ends up getting recycled. And recycling rules vary. Even within Toronto, what I can recycle at work is different than what I can recycle at home. We have private and public garbage companies. So it's very messy. Of course, when consumers see that, they want to do the right thing, but they put the onus on industry, of course, to fix it. And if you think about a year ago, the term single-use plastic wasn't anything that had any consumer awareness, and now it's discussed all the time. First, we saw foam packaging being outlawed and takeout in Vancouver, plastic straws gone. But what's happened with COVID, we've taken a huge step back, right? Everything now from a safety standpoint, everything's in plastic bags. You can't bring your own bags into a lot of grocery stores. So has taken a bit of a back seat. But we do think it's going to come back with a bit of a vengeance. There's going to be a bit of a consumer guilt offset. In the past, pre-COVID, you were able to bring your own containers to Metro, for instance. You could bring your own container, fill it up, take it home. Bulk Barn, the same thing. You had Starbucks, Tim Hortons with bring your own mug. All those programs have been put on hold right now, and it's not for your safety, it's for the frontline worker safety. There aren't those safety protocols in place yet, but I do think that industry will figure this out, and we will go back to this. And if you think about it, Andrea mentioned I used to work for Molson. You know, one thing the beer industry did really well way back was come up with that industry standard bottle that got recycled an average of 15 times. So it would get, you know, received back, it would be cleaned, refilled, relabeled, and it was sort of an evergreen bottle. So we do think that this is going to come back. Why? You've all seen pictures like this. This is Venice and the canal. And for the first time, you actually can see the water and the fish in there. They've always been there, you just couldn't see it before. So we think that post-COVID, there's going to be a bit of a pivot to planet health and sustainability. This is kind of the first time we've seen the entire world on the same side with an issue, right? And that's beating COVID. You know, even in the world wars, we were all, you know, different countries were on different sides. For once, we're all on the same side, and we're seeing how the world can tackle something. So as a result, we're seeing consumer optimism around the ability to repair the environment go up. There was just a recent April study, 55% of consumers claim to be more conscious about the environment, and 35% claim to be more attentive to sustainability claims. And so I think that tells you that you are well positioned right now. The time is right for that kind of sustainability messaging because consumers want to see a change. They're coming out of COVID feeling a little guilty about impact on climate and knowing that they can make a change. So expect to see more of that coming. Another one of the trends we talked about was Know Me, and that was the whole idea of artificial intelligence and being able to really hyper-personalize your experience at food service or retail. And, you know, for instance, McDonald's bought 2 artificial intelligence companies last year. So if you drive into a McDonald's, they can key off your license plate know who you are, know what you ordered last time, and see if you want to use it again. Have the same order. They've also integrated with weather data. So if it's a really hot day, they may say, hey, along with that burger and fries you usually get, Ms. McArthur, would you also like a soft serve ice cream? Slightly terrifying, but I think this is the world going forward. I think consumers are accepting a bit of a trade-off. And I've got, this is an actual company that's piloted in the UK and have now moved to the US. Hopefully this is going to play for us well. It is not. Apologies. We can send the link out later for that. But what we're seeing, groceries obviously had a record year and will continue to have a record year. They are investing more as we speak in customizing the shopping experience, especially as more of it moves digital. And so they're using more apps. More consumers of all generations are actually using these apps. A lot of boomers who hadn't used technology very well, their kids and grandkids are now teaching them and forcing them to use it as a way to protect their safety. And largely consumers are accepting this trade-off of data privacy and security in order to protect their personal security. So I do think you're going to see more customization based on your personal data. One thing we talked about was IBM's Watson Trend Spotter. If you are a Jeopardy fan, you know Watson, you know, that huge supercomputer. And this had been something that IBM had launched about a year ago to help increase the success of new products. We know that over 80% of new products fail, and that has been the rate for decades. We just don't seem to be getting any better at this. And so they had this new algorithm that scraped QSR menus and Instagram and all the data out there to try to predict. But as I said earlier, the future is not going to look like the past. So anything right now that is focusing on an algorithm is going to have a really hard time doing a great job because all bets are off. All past behavior is changing as we speak. So I'm going to hop into the next one, which is Save Me. And we know that pre-COVID, climate change was already a top of mind issue, but what we're seeing is a lot more discussion now around protein sources. If you look at Asia, where they are further ahead in terms of the COVID curve, we're seeing plant-based eating surging there. And we think that we're at a point where it's a real tipping point from aspirational to necessity. And we know that meat sales surged initially with that rise in sort of the familiar comfort foods, but consumers are starting, they're hearing more about our food system, about our industrial processing, things they never really thought about, knew about. And this is some Google Trends data. You can see a huge jump in consumers actually going online and Googling meat processing to learn more. So I think you can expect that we are going to have a lot more conversation around this on how we raise and slaughter our livestock. And you know, what are consumers going to be willing to trade off? We're going into a recession. Meat prices are probably going to go up. So will consumers want to eat better for the environment meats? We know that over time, meat has come down in price. Historically, it used to be a very expensive protein, but over time it's come down. And at the same time, consumers' portions have gone up. So maybe we will see a change there as well. And perhaps more of a climatarian diet where consumers, you know, start making food choices based on not just their food preferences or values, but also based on impact on the planet, carbon footprint, those sort of things. We know there's always a gap between what consumers would like to do and what they actually do, but this is something that we expect more of. Nobody here is probably old enough to remember World War II. There were actually posters talking about victory meat. which when there were meat shortages, this whole idea of let's blend protein, let's blend, oats with meat. Certainly when I was growing up, my mother, to extend the grocery budget, would make meatloaf or burgers that way. And we're starting to see products coming out which are 50-50. Meat and pea protein or something else, or mushrooms, vegetables, as a way of doing flexitarian a little bit differently. This whole concept of, do you have to give up everything because meat tastes great? So is there a different way of lowering your impact? And that's something we're starting to see. And not just in meat. We're starting to see this with milks. A 50-50 blend of dairy and almond. Those are by some US milk processors. Baby Bell, which is the biggest cheese company in France, they're coming out with a 50-50 cheese product as well. So again, a slightly different way of doing things. And you probably saw Starbucks CEO, they did a measurement on the chain and their carbon footprint and saw that dairy was the biggest impact in the chain. So they now actually are asking consumers to use alternatives or go black or green. And so will there be a move to more sustainable animal proteins, and will consumers trade up to those levels, like those labels like grass-fed? We know that meat and dairy are hot buttons for younger generations, millennial, Gen Z especially. And so can you trade them up to less resource-intensive ag practices? This is Blue Nest is out of the US. They actually use regenerative ag practices, and as a result, Audubon has certified that they use bird-friendly, protect bird-friendly grasslands. So that's, I think, an interesting approach. Also, will we start seeing consumers embrace different cuts? If we are looking at shortages down the road, quite often, we have exported those cuts that consumers don't like, the organ meats, those sort of things. And in the UK, there actually was a push in January of this year by doctors trying to get people to minimize waste and maximize nutrition by eating some of these different offcuts. We've seen something very similar happen in Canada around seafood already, where consumers are starting, because there's some shortages that are showing up, consumers are starting to try different species than they normally will. So question, is this something that we could possibly see with beef as well? And so, you are making a lower impact product, so perfect time to start communicating that with consumers. Another trend we talked about was Science Me, and that was the whole discussion around what is real food. And consumers have moved away from processed food largely in the last little while to eat more real food, shorter ingredient lists. But if you look at some of these replacement products, they have very long ingredient lists. So there's definitely a trade-off going on. So we thought that there might be a start of a backlash around this. And in the US, you actually have seen full page ads that have been paid for by a not-for-profit that's funded by some restaurateurs, fast food companies, Tyson as well. It's really calling out, what's hiding in your plant-based meat. So we've seen, milk replacements take off. We're starting to see these products take off without a lot of discussion around them. And so we thought we'd start to see some of these come up. One of the things we've seen is ultra processed has been a discussion. And in France, we've actually seen they're looking at labeling products that they consider ultra processed on packaging. The CEO of Chipotle said, we're never going to use these products. We only use real whole ingredients. We've seen these faux meats reformulate, trying to get to a shorter ingredient list. But this is one trend we think could fall off the table because, you know, science is certainly has a new appreciation. Consumers have a new appreciation for it because it could be the thing that could save us. So I think that this is a trend that possibly could be falling off the table. Last trend before I pass it over to Len, that was the whole idea of entertain me, food, you know, grocery shopping and the whole experiential trend. And, you know, some of you may have heard of Eataly in Toronto, but even your local supermarket certainly has gotten a little more experiential. Of course, this has all changed with COVID. You're no longer sampling, is no longer happening. So that's shifting, food's shifting digitally. But what we do know is that relationships with farmers are growing. So if you look at farmers markets, they were actually dying off a bit prior to 2008. And that recession really caused the resurgence of farmers markets because consumers wanted to support their community. Whether they knew their neighbor or not, farmers markets were a way of doing that. And when we say local, that extends to all of Canada. And so we're also seeing consumers starting to develop more direct to producer relationships. And I think some of that will continue post-COVID. And we are also seeing more of the grocery, I think, will go online, the staples, those sort of things, the center aisle, but I think consumers will still enjoy buying fresh. But I think you need to start telling your producer stories. It's really going to be important to put a face on companies and brands. You all know how disconnected consumers are from their food system, but we also know that they want to know more. That was the CCFI research showed that 91% of consumers really didn't know much about the food system. But if, again, you can see that the food supply has been something that's been Googled more than ever in the past 5 years. We know that farmers and producers, you are the trusted people. So how can you tell your stories and connect with consumers, especially if you can't be in store? And so I just wanted to show a couple of ideas. This is an Irish family of potato farmers who actually turn those potatoes into chips, potato chips, and they've got something called SpudNav on the back. So you buy this, you go onto the website and you put in that code and you are immediately taken to the field where those potatoes came from. You know those potato chips are going to taste fresher. And then this is an egg farmer in the US, an egg producer, and you can actually go in and there's a QR code and you can see pictures of those happy hens and the pasture they're hanging out with that just laid your eggs. So these are some of the things that the future could hold. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Len.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, just let me know if my slides are up there okay. Take that as a yes. We good? Oh, show my screen. All right. All good to go, Andrea?
You bet.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I'll jump right in. So Andrea asked me to reflect a little bit on COVID and sustainability in light of the trends that we had included in the trend report from the ag side of the business. So sustainability right now is a really interesting one. I'd say in some ways there's more and less emphasis on it. Less emphasis in the fact that things like plastic straws and plastic bags. So plastic bags became the bane of, it was like having a social disease for a point in time. It was just not something to be done. And all of a sudden you cannot, at least in the Guelph area, bring your own bags into the supermarkets. So some of these things are actually less. It's really early days here, and as Joanne said, it's extremely difficult to know how this is all going to shake out. So I hesitate to call any of these trends, but I do wonder about even things like certified sustainable beef being as hot button an item as it, until this resolves. So I do think longer term, these are still going to be important, but in the short term, they may have lost some emphasis. However, sustainability when it comes to agriculture is now a little more focused on local availability. So how sustainable is our local food supply, given that we're having disruptions in trade, disruptions in distribution? So my next point is distribution, logistics, and food availability. I am pretty convinced, I don't have data to prove it, but that consumers by and large were not thinking about distribution and logistics when it came to food until the moment they went in a grocery store and couldn't find their favorite cut of beef, or there were eggs not at the store. And when they delved into it, you find out that supply is not the issue, it's distribution and logistics. So that's definitely something that's changed in the short term. Related to the next point, which is where the heck does my food come from? So these shortages and the outbreaks in packing plants have got consumers looking a little bit more deeply into Canada's food supply system and how it actually works. So I'm of the opinion, coming from the ag side, that by and large, I've seen data that previous to now, Canadians generally trusted their food supply and weren't all that engaged with it. And nothing proves that more than if you ever go to the Royal Winter Fair and you see school kids coming up to the livestock displays and, repelled by the smell or not knowing why a cow is one color and not another. So there's two sides to that coin. Either the positive side, which I take, is that Canadians generally are confident in their food system. The other is, that they're repelled by it, which I don't think is the case, or they have doubts. But now a lot more attention on where food comes from, and therefore a lot more attentions on farmers and the agri-food system. Can my food make me sick? So not so much food safety per se, or food poisoning, those kind of things, but when I get takeout, is the packaging going to cause me to have COVID? So again, a lot more attention on the food. On the ag side, of course, there's market access issues. So as borders close and it's harder for people to traverse, there's also trade implications. And our friend to the south, Mr. Trump, is musing aloud about shutting borders to Canadian beef. Now, that was only one data point, and it, typically with Trump, it may come and go, but it is something in addition to the usual concerns about trade relations with China. Social distance on the farm and in the farm community. So a lot of people think of farming as a solitary activity. As we all know, farmers are extremely social. So coffee shop meetings and meetings in the field and small tours and all these things. I just read today that Canada's Outdoor Farm Show in the East is going to go virtual, and I think that's the case for a lot of trade shows. So what does social distance on the farm look like? This is an interesting one, the role of government in agriculture. We have gone from stay out of my way, farmers tend to be rigidly independent and want less government, to now looking for relief, show me the money. So that's something that's philosophically changing. That I would expect to go back as things normalize. Here's a scary and maybe a positive thing. Meat has made the New York Times. There are 4 stories since May 14th. The big one that I'm sure a lot of you have seen is the end of meat is near. There's one called plant-based meats catch on in the pandemic. Meat packing plants reopening, but are they safe? And America's obsession with cheap meat. Usually when agriculture makes the front page of the New York Times, it's not a good news story. Usually there's a concern. But in this case, it reflects that increased interest in food availability, where food comes from. And finally, workers make farms work. So a lot of this has been about migrant workers, but we've had a farm labor issue for at least 10 or 15 years. A lot of farm parents who used to tell their kids, don't come back to the farm, are now saying, please come back to the farm. And now that we've got issues with people movement over borders, of course, we're seeing that effect on agriculture. So the wheel's definitely still in spin, but these are some of the things that possibly have changed since we published our trend report. In terms of the ag trends that we covered in the trend report, what I'd say is COVID has largely amplified those. So I'll go through them really quickly. One of the trends that we talk about is Nourish Me Locally. So that's an emphasis on local food. We focused on a couple of initiatives, one of which in Ontario was called Serving Up Local, in which we looked at, a pilot project that involved institutions like universities and hospitals sourcing more of their food locally. So this was a 2.5-year pilot project. It resulted in significant increase in grown local servings. And one of the questions I got before was, what were the cost implications? I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they were found to be minimal. So it's possible to source local and not have a negative financial impact. This is a fairly big $745 million annual spend on food in institutions in Ontario. So it's really critical that this is something that could really move the needle. And of course, there's room in the farm for that. So given the time here, I'll kind of skip through this a little bit quickly, but this idea of local, and now with COVID, this idea of guaranteed access to all the food you need and want when you want it being challenged. There is an increased focus on local. Farmers have a chance to connect with these providers. Retailers have a chance to connect back with farmers. So that's a positive, I think. Related to that, we looked at micro farming. We call this trend Near Me, which is actually growing or farming in very dense urban settings. So finding innovative ways to bring local food right to where the consuming public is. And I would say there's a significant interest in this. So farming for the last 100 years has been consolidating, fewer farmers, bigger farms. This is a violent move away from that to make it hyper local. Urban farms, there's 3 examples I've provided here. And now more than ever, community gardens were one of the first things to open up in Guelph. I apologize for being a bit Guelph-centric, but with the thought that this is not only something that can help with the food supply, but also something people safely can do out of their homes. So if you're a retailer, again, it's about finding ways to connect with these local urban farmers who may be operating. And if you're in food service, there's a story to be told here which can help differentiate the products that you serve. The last one, and these trends actually line up with many of the things that Joanne talked about. Teach Me. So we looked at surveys, the biggest one being the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, which shows, without going through all the numbers, that the vast majority of Canadians know very little about where their food comes from and the Canadian agri-food system, but want to know more. And we have a window here because in Canada anyway, it's not a negative. We're not starting from a negative place. We're starting from a neutral to slightly positive place. The research that I've seen shows that farmers and veterinarians are among the top 5 most trusted sources of information. 35% of people believe our food system is heading in the right direction. That doesn't sound like a huge number, but it's better than the US. And the vast majority of the rest of the consumers don't believe it's going in a bad direction. They just want to know more. So a challenge for all of us on the phone and all of us in the industry is find ways to help build trust and be part of the solution here. I think one thing that COVID is teaching us is that it's going to be really hard for those of us in the agri-food system to just hide behind the food inspection system and hope that no one notices. We are being thrust into the spotlight, and I think our industry is really well suited to step up to that challenge. We do publish this report. You can get it at nourish.marketing, or I don't know that the QR code is going to work through a webinar, but we'll leave that information up there, and more or less on time, so open for questions.
Great, thank you, Len and Joanne. I'm just going to take the screen back and we will open our Q&A session. So let's open this up with, can you talk about the one major impact that you feel this current COVID crisis will have overall in the Canadian agri-food sector? And maybe also on the beef industry specifically? You kind of touched on it, but if you have any extra comments on that, maybe I'll start with Joanne.
To me, the biggest thing is newfound cooking skills. That step back from convenience, portability, summoning your meal to actually making it yourself. I think that's huge. So that would be number one for me. And then, as Len said, just the whole opening up of how food actually gets to us. Consumers never thought about that. They had no idea how things ended up in their supermarket. And now they're saying, huh. So that's just opened a whole Pandora's box, which could be good, I think, for producers. Yeah. And I'm sorry if I can add one other. I think Canadian, that whole local supporting by Canadian, I think that's going to be, it was already growing, but I think we're going to see that on steroids post-COVID.
Well, thank you, Joanne, for taking all my answers. I'm not sure that I've got one big thing, but I will say, you know, for the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, I do think Canadian consumers' minds are open now in ways that they haven't been before. And I think Joanne's right. Availability, distribution, logistics, it's boring, but it does pave the path to tell a great local story. And I think if we're going to start talking about sustainable, and Andrea's heard me talk about this, it's a time that we can play offense instead of defense. Consumers appreciate food now in ways that they didn't before. So I'm sort of the designated shopper now. I'm not as nervous about going to the store. So I go, and there's excitement around the egg case. You know, there's eggs here. So I do think it opens a window for us to tell our story that may not have been open before. I find we were in ag and in the beef sector, we play defense a lot. I think we have a chance to not be obnoxious about it, but to confidently tell our story.
Great. And this question is for Joanne and kind of along the same lines, but how do you share more about where our food comes from, including those producer stories that you talked about, but without seeming like we are educating them, which we know that consumers don't really respond to?
Right. Invite them in however you can. So if that's actually having people come to your operation, if that's sharing pictures on your website, we always say it's better to show versus tell. So, you know, to write something on a website or on a package, that's one thing to show, you know, the face behind the food. Powerful, but if you can actually link it to something, whether, you know, sort of opening that barn door and inviting consumers in and see a little bit of what life on the farm is like. You know, food always tastes better when it's served with a story. Everybody has a great story. You go into this for, you know, for love. It's not just a job if you're a farmer. So you need to share those stories, why you do it. And I think that overcomes a lot of, you know, when I see consumer activists out there, you know, there's no farmer that ever wants to do anything but the best for their herd. And so just making it human and sharing and opening up, whether that's through, you know, the QR code that I showed you, those sort of ideas, but always think of how can we invite the consumer in on our daily routine.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, and this is a bit of a shameless plug for one of our other clients, but there's groups out there like the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, Farm Credit Canada, there's others that are trying to get the industry to act cooperatively. So one thing, I've been at this a long time, and I'd say our industry does not always act with a unified voice, and maybe that's impossible, but I think if we're willing to get behind some of these larger initiatives, it casts our industry in a more positive light.
Great, thanks for that. And this question was for Len. So you're talking about the local trend. Can you talk a bit about what is the role of sort of the individual farmer in connecting to the consumers? You know, you mentioned it's important for the retailer to connect the farmers, but if you have any advice for individual farmers and ranchers, what would it be in order to make that connection with the consumers?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I think it depends on the individual and the situation. So not everyone's equally comfortable doing this, but there are always opportunities. So at a local level, every community has a local newspaper, and I think farmers, if I'm going to generalize, and I shouldn't because not all farmers are the same, but generally are not looking for coverage in media, and in some ways tend to shy away from it. So, I always say be ready, and, part of what we do in our practice is media training. So we'll train up our clients. I'm not saying farmers have to get media training, but be willing to engage with the media. And, every farmer in Canada has a storefront, and making sure that their farm is attractive and clean, and maybe there's a sign up front. So there's not a single big thing, but it's just being involved with communities, being present. There's groups that put on, CropLife Canada puts on confident conversations. So get some training on how to speak with confidence about our industry. So I think it's all those things.
Great. And maybe this can be the last question as we're running up to our time, but thinking about the Science Me section, have there been any trends regarding the lab-based so-called meat and their consumer interest in that? Just thinking back to your comments around how science is redefining what people think is real food.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We've seen with lab-grown foods, and also just the whole embracing of science actually resonates more with younger consumers, so Gen Z, millennials. They seem to embrace the concept of lab-grown meat more so than other generations. And they also seem to be, I think, this is a way in for the whole GMO conversation, which so far has not been done well, frankly. There's a total misunderstanding of what a GMO is by consumers, but those younger generations understand that there is going to be a role for science in order to feed the world sustainably with growing populations. So I think it's largely a generational thing. Lab grown so far is just not economic, but that could change one day.
Yeah, we really bitched up the GMO labeling, calling it genetically modified organisms. If we could go back in time, we should have come up with a better moniker like sustain ag technology or something like that. Mm-hmm. Too late now.
Great. Well, thank you both. Just before we wrap up today, I'd like to just let everybody know about some upcoming events and webinars that we are also, in addition to this subject. Next week, we're going to be talking about understanding and promoting mental health in agriculture, which is a really important issue right at the moment as we move through this COVID situation. June 9th, we are going to hear an agriculture and beef economic outlook. And then June 16th, we're looking at CRSB providing some information about some tools that we have for our members to help you communicate about sustainability. So those are coming up, and we invite you to check out our website for more details and the registration links, and we hope to see you again. And we'd like to just leave you today with, we talk about sustainability as being a journey rather than a destination that we're trying to get to, and it's a constantly evolving thing. And so just this little bit of a snapshot of what we've accomplished together with this multi-stakeholder membership that we have of folks across the supply chain. So we've got lots of exciting things, and we know that there's going to be more work to be done and lots of great progress coming. So with that, I think we'll wrap up for today. We're right on the hour, and we would like to thank you for joining us today. I think this information today has given us a lot to think about, as a little bit of an uncertain year that 2020 has been so far, and given some good key insights into our consumers' mindset. So if you haven't already, be sure to join us for upcoming events, and we hope you stay healthy and safe, and wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thanks.